I'll let you know when it starts. And all right, we are recording for our editing demo for our macro or manual focus photography project. So again, want to make sure we can edit and really bring out the sharpness and detail of 4 of our photos. Whatever the main area you're focusing on, how we can really bring that out. So let's go into here. Oh, wrong folder, sorry. And then let's just gonna clean out my folder real quick. There we go. Saving out different versions earlier. Okay, so just a couple reminders when you're shooting. So if you do have a camera with a zoomed lens, like a 2x lens, like maybe you have like an A+ or newer where it has like the 2 or the 3 lenses. If you have that 2x lens, that's the one I would use for this project if I was using a smartphone. So this is the 1x, that's as close as I could get to focus on this water area. And then this is the 2x. So we can get much closer with that zoomed lens. Same with using a real camera. Try to use a little bit more zoom and it'll let you get a little closer. So this one, I was shooting the succulent and I was thinking, wow, that's really cool. But like, what should I focus on? And then I noticed like this one little spike was kind of by itself. So I made sure to get that little spike sharpened and focused, right? So really kind of figure out like, what's my subject? What's like maybe something that stands out like a logo or a product or something, and get that thing nice and sharp. And so this one, again, I thought it looked kind of cool. It had like all this water accumulating in the succulent. You can actually see the trees and the sun reflecting in that water. It's kind of cool. So this is the photo I wanted to show for the demo. So we got a nice subject that's sticking out, right? I'm nice and close, got it nice and in focus. So what I want to do now is how can I bring out just the sharpness and details of just this one subject and not apply a filter to the whole photo? So how can I just get just my subject to be sharper and not sharpen my background and foreground? Basically helping it to stand out. So the first way I wanted to share was with, if you were able to download Adobe Bridge, again, you can change the format in Adobe Bridge for different views up here. I prefer the film strip view because it lets me click the space bar and go full screen. And also I get the bigger preview. You can adjust all these different windows, depending on what it is you're doing. And then you can still navigate around. So what I'm going to do down here in the thumbnails, I'm going to right click or control click. I'm going to make a copy. So whatever device you're using, I recommend make a copy first and then edit on the copy. If I mess up my edit and I realize, oh wow, I shouldn't have done that, I can always just trash it. And then I always have my original to go back to. So that's how we're non-destructive when we edit, is we always work on a copy, always save the original. So if I ever mess up, I can just go back to it and make a new copy of it. So I'm just going to open up the copy version into Camera Raw, which again, if you have a Lightroom, it's very similar to Camera Raw, has a lot of similar features. You'll kind of notice that when I'm using Camera Raw. All right. So again, if you want to, do different adjustments to your photo, that's cool. What I'm really grading on is the sharpness and the details of your subject. So if you want to do other edits, that's cool. But what I'm really focusing on, are you adding sharpness or texture or high pass just to your subject area? That's what we're kind of grading on. So again, when I have these different tabs, like the basic tab open in Camera Raw and I slide down, you'll see, I'll zoom in on my little guy here so you can see it better. When I bring up the texture slider, this is a more newer one. This is before and this is after. So it does bring out details, like smaller details with texture. And that is useful for this project. So this is before, a little softer, and this is more kind of gritty textury. The problem is it's applying it to everything, my background and foreground. So I just wanted to go just on my subject. And just for reference, clarity will wrap around bigger shapes. And so you can kind of see what's going on here. This is texture and clarity both added. So different looks, texture wraps around smaller shapes, clarity wraps around bigger shapes, just so you know. So I wouldn't recommend clarity as much, maybe a little bit, that's fine. But again, it is applying it to the whole photo. I can also scroll down to where it says detail and add sharpening. So I can expand sharpening, I can change the radius and the detail amount and the total amount. and you'll see it'll really start to sharpen things up the more I, increase those little sliders. So now it's like super crazy sharp. So probably way too sharp. So I'm just gonna bring that back to 0. And then I'm just gonna return my texture and clarity back to 0 as well. So what I wanna do is bring out just my subjects instead of applying to the whole photo. So I'm gonna go over to my tools. And again, if you're not sure which tools which, just kind of hover over it and I'll tell you in a little description what it is. So I wanna use my adjustment brush. Some of you guys tried this out on the last project, which is good. It'll definitely help for this one. So as you can see with my adjustment brush, I can change the size of it. So how big or small I want it. So that depends on how big your subject is. The feather is going to be how soft of an edge it'll blend. So I can have it a really hard edge. You can kind of see the outside of my circle is very close. Or if I max it out, it'll start to blend it further away. So just something to think about. I can adjust the flow so it's really light or really strong. For this one, I would just put it at 100 and then just adjust your size and keep your feather pretty good. And then if I scroll down, I can do selective adjustments. So make sure all these are set to 0 before you start. And so then if I go down to the bottom, we have texture, clarity, and if I go further down, I have sharpness. So I'm going to increase my sharpness. I'm going to increase my texture. I'm going to just max it out to 100 just so it's easier to see for you viewing. I'm going to bring in my clarity just a little bit. So then wherever I paint with my adjustment brush, we'll only be adding those features. So I'm adding sharpening, texture, and a little bit of clarity just to where I paint. So I'm just going to go over my subject here and just paint there. And I get the little spinning ball because I got a lot of windows open. Okay. So again, I'm avoiding painting on other areas and just painting on my subject. So this is probably too much. This is before and this is after. So really kind of extreme, but it does help you guys see when you're viewing through a webcam right now. So now that I just have it just on my subject, what I want to do is save those settings onto my photo. So I'm just going to open it into Photoshop. So I'm going to click open. It's going to pop up in Photoshop. And then I'm going to save those camera raw settings onto my photo. Try to get this thing going. Once I start opening up Bridge and Photoshop and Stream at the same time, it kind of slows everything down. But we'll get it going. So once I open it into Photoshop, come on, buddy. Here we go. So if you are using Photoshop, I do recommend close out your other programs and your computer will run a little better. So I want to save these camera raw settings on it, so I'm just going to go File and Save. It's already a copy, so I'm just going to replace it because in camera raw, it always wants you to save as. So I already have it named something else. I could change the name if I wanted to, but I'm going to leave that. And then I'm going to make sure it's in the right folder, and then it's the right format. So make sure it's a JPEG, and then I'm just going to save it out, replace it, and make sure my quality is at 12 and hit OK. And now it's going to save that to that folder. So now if I go back to Bridge, this is my original, and then this is my camera raw, right? So I'm just bringing out just that subject area, nice and sharp and textured and well clarity. So I'm just going to call this thing 7810 and camera raw, so we can kind of compare the other softwares when we edit them. So that's camera raw. What I want to do now is open up Photo P. Photo P again is very similar to Photoshop. So I'm just going to go to photop.com. I'm actually going to close out Photoshop just so it helps it run a little quicker. I'm going to quit that program and then go to Photo P. All right, so when I'm in Photo P, I'm just going to go File, Open, select my photo, and there we go. So there's a couple different methods, but what I'm going to show you today is all about how we use layers. This is still applies. If I open this straight into Photoshop, I would do the same thing. So if I didn't open in Camera Raw and I open it straight into Photoshop, Photopea and Photoshop are very, very similar. So what I'm gonna do is go to Layer and then hit Duplicate Layer. And what that does is it makes a copy of my layer. You can see on the right now I got a background and background copy. In my history, I got my first step and then my duplicate layer. So the reason why we want to work on a separate layer is if I add anything to this layer, I can only go back 20 steps in the history, and if I miss something, and then I'm kind of screwed, right? So then I can always just select this layer, drag it to the little trash bin, and delete it, and then I can start over. So that's how you always work non-destructively. A lot of graphic design teachers teach you just like, oh, just work on one layer, and then you'll be fine. But you can only undo so many steps when you're working. So that's why you work on a new layer, and then you can, if you mess up, you can always throw it in the trash. So I'm just gonna go layer and duplicate layer. So two options I could do. There is, if you click on the tools, a sharpen tool over here. If you click on the blur and go down, it'll say sharpen. So again, you can change the strength. So I'm just gonna bring that up to 100%, and then you can change the size of it. So I'm just going to click on my layer and zoom in so you guys can see this a little better. Then if I paint with the sharpen tool, wherever I kind of go, it's gonna sharpen that area. So it is Photopea, so it does go a little slower. Again, I'm just working through my Google Chrome browser here. So it's doing the best, but it's doing pretty good, and it's sharpening out my cycling. Now it's getting really sharp. There we go. So you can see if I turn the little eye here, I can turn it off and turn it on, right? So it's really kind of sharpening it up. If it's too much, the cool thing about working on a separate layer is I can change the opacity of that layer. Maybe I don't want to show 100% of that sharpness, but I want to show like 53%. So I can always adjust the opacity, and that's why it's a benefit to work on a separate layer. So I'm actually just going to throw this in the trash again and show you a different method that gives you more control. So I'm going to go into layer, duplicate layer. So copy my background layer. I'm going to apply a filter to my layer. This is the same as Photoshop. So if I was in Photoshop, it's the same location. Go to filter, down to other, over to high pass. And what the high pass filter lets you do is it lets you really control the radius of what is bringing details out. So I'm going to kind of zoom in so you can see this. So it looks really grayed out and weird, but I can start dragging it. So right now it's at 3 pixels. If I drag it to the right, it'll increase the pixel radius. So you start seeing when I change the pixel radius, how it changes, how it wraps around details. So that's the benefit of high pass, is you can really figure out what's the best one, because each photo you upload, depending on the shape of your subject or the resolution that you uploaded from your camera, that'll affect the high pass radius. So this gives you more control. So I'm just going to go kind of in the teens. You can also type in, so 15 is looking good, so I'm going to hit OK. So it still looks really weird and gray, right? But we can see it's kind of bringing out the details. So what I need to do is do something called change the layer blending mode. So if I click on where it says normal, so again, I have my high pass layer selected. I'm going to click on normal, and then I'm going to scroll down. And these are called blending modes. There's lots of different blending modes. You're going to go to the middle where it says overlay. And so now it makes it clear. How overlay, it kind of works as like a contrast to a gray layer like that. So then I'm just going to kind of zoom in so you can see this. So I'm going to turn the eye off and then turn it back on. So you can see how it's bringing out the texture on my subject. This was no filter and then high pass filter. But again, it's doing it to the whole photo. So we want to control that. One thing to think about too is if it's too strong, again, I can bring the opacity down of that layer. And then there is other blending modes that work with this. So I'll show you what they are. One sec. I'm just going to scroll up here. Here we go. So there's overlay. Soft light is a little softer, and hard light is a little stronger than overlay. So I'm just going to do hard light just so you can really see. Here's before and after. You can really see that texture popping. So if you really want to bring out details, use hard light. And again, if it's too strong, just bring it down to a lower percentage, right? So I'm just going to keep it at 100 so you can see it easily on your computer. So now it's applying it to my whole photo. So how do I control that? So just like in Photoshop, I'm going to select that layer, And then I'm going to go down to the bottom right where underneath my layers, and there's different options. If you hover over each of these little logos or like symbols, you got different things. I can add a new layer, I can delete a layer, I can add it to a group, I can add a roster mask, and I can add adjustment layers. So I'm going to choose the one that says add roster mask. In Photoshop, that's called add layer mask, but it looks the same. It looks like a little Japanese flag, like the rectangle with a circle in it. So I'm just going to click on that, and it's going to add a roster mask to that layer. So like this is before, and if I click it, it's going to add a roster mask. When a roster mask or a layer mask is white, it's going to show what's in that layer, and when it's black, it's not going to show. So if I invert this from white to black, so I'm going to press Control I or Command I on a Mac, Control I on a PC. I'm basically making it go from white to black, so now it's not showing any of the filter on that layer. I'm going to go to my paintbrush, so just the standard brush tool. Again, I can change the size of my brush, so I'm going to make it a bit bigger. I'm going to change the hardness, so it's a softer edge, so it's a little smoother transition. I could change the flow and opacity, but I'm just going to leave that at 100. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here, and right now my brush is set to black, so I'm just going to click this little arrow where I can switch it between black and white. So I'm going to switch that so it's white. I'm actually going to make my brush a little bit bigger. Here we go. Okay. So then wherever I paint with my brush set to white will show that filter. So that's the benefit of using a layer mask in Photoshop or a raster mask in Photo P, is I can really control with my paintbrush where it goes, painting just white or black. So I'm just going to kind of paint my subject. Here we go. That looks good. So here you can see on my layer mask it's black around my subject and it's white where I painted. So if I turn this off and turn it on, you only see it painted just on my subject. So I'm not putting my filter on the foreground or background, it's just on my subject where I painted. And again, I can change the opacity. I can also keep changing the blending modes if I want to, but that looks pretty good. So the last thing I need to do, and this again is the same step in Photoshop, I'm just going to go layer and then go down to the bottom where it says flatten image. And what that does is it's going to combine those layers into my background layer. So this was before, and then flatten image. So again, just go to layer all the way down, same as Photoshop, flatten image, and I'll combine them together. And then I can save this out as a JPEG. So I'm going to go File, Export, JPEG as the format. Make sure my quality is at 100 and hit save. So now it's going to download that to my computer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this thing Photo P. So I'm just going to title it Photo P and put that in the succulent folder. So now if I go back to my folder, I got my original, I got my camera raw, and now I got my Photo P. So with the high pass, you know, you can, this is before, after, and Photo P. So pretty good. Showing the differences. So I'm just going to do it real quick in Photoshop, but it's the same thing as Photo P. So I'm just going to make a quick copy. I'm going to call this thing Photoshop. All right. And then I'm just going to open into Photoshop real quick. I'm actually going to close out Photo P because that takes up my RAM. So I'm going to leave that. Let's go to Photoshop. Any questions so far? So, and then I'm going to show Photoshop Express on the smartphone last. Come on, homie. There we go. So same thing as Photo P. I'm just going to go layer, duplicate layer, and then hit OK. So it copies my background layer. There is a sharpen tool over here, just like Photo P. I'm going to use the high pass. So I'm just going to go filter, other, high pass. Again, I can change the radius. So I can do finer details or bigger details. So for this one, it's good in the teens. So I'm going to do about 17.6. I'm going to change my blending mode to overlay, soft light, and hard light. This one's nice because it previews it. I'm just going to do hard light just to show it easier for you guys to see. I'm going to add a layer mask, so a little kind of Japanese flag in the bottom right below my layers. I'm going to click on that, add that to my layer. I'm going to press Control or Command I to invert it. I'm going to select my brush. I can change the size, hardness of the edge, the flow. I'm going to switch it to white. So then wherever I paint with a white brush, will show that high pass filter. So just like Photopea, same concept. So I'm doing this pretty quick. If I do mess up, let's say I paint over here and bring out the details, I can just switch that to black and paint it away. Because whatever is white shows and whatever black doesn't show. And you can see where I painted on my little thumbnail. So last thing, I'm just going to go layer down to the bottom. I'm going to flatten my layers, so flatten image, and then save it. So file save, hit OK. So that's my quick Photoshop high pass. For the smartphone, we got Photoshop Express. So I'm just going to open up that photo on my phone. Where's it at? Here we go. So here's the photo. So what I would do with Photoshop Express, we can't really paint it where we want it to go. So what I'm going to do is apply the sharpen and the texture to the whole photo. And then we're going to add a blur around it to kind of make it back to blurry around our subject. So I'm just going to go into my adjustments. I'm going to scroll over to effects. And then I'm going to add a little bit of clarity. So let's turn that up. And then I'm going to go over to details and click on sharpen. And I'm going to bring up my sharpen quite a bit just so you can see it easier. You can get rid of this little box, these little previews, by clicking on that little tab. And so now it's applying it to the whole photo. So what we want to do is basically blur out the area around. So we keep just our subject sharp. So I'm going to scroll over here to where it says blur. And so again, with using two fingers, you can adjust the size of that circle area depending on how big your subject is. Use one finger to move it into place. So I'm just going to kind of keep the area of kind of the top here. You can also adjust the outer ring using two fingers. Let's see if I can do this. So that's the kind of feather amount. And then you just use the slider to start blurring it out. So I'm just going to kind of max it out. But you can see here the center area is sharp and detailed, and then it fades out, and then it gets more blurry towards the edges. So I'm kind of doing the opposite way. I'm applying it to the whole photo, but then I'm adding back some blur, so then it just keeps that area sharp and in focus. Once you're finished, you're just going to press that little output button, select Save to Camera Roll, and I'll save that to your phone. So then I'd upload the original and then the edit. All right, so I'm going to stop recording.